Welcome to Commander Central, episode 209, and today we'll be taking a look at listener Walker Telton's 2+2=5 Jenara Asura of War deck. I'm Dana.
And I'm Max.
Max, how you doing?
Pretty good. I'm trying to do the math. Last time I checked, 2+2 did not equal 5.
I'm not 100% certain either way with America's education system as it is. I don't want to commit fully to that answer being right or wrong. So I guess I could just dig my calculator out, but we'll take care of that off air.
Okay.
Anything exciting going on with you? Play any fun games in the last couple days?
We got together this past weekend and played a game.
We did.
I got
in person, one 5-player game.
one 5-player game that I swiftly ended.
Yeah, yes. So that's the first in-person Magic I had played in 4 months.
Yeah, I was going to say pretty much since February, I think.
Yeah.
Ooh.
I know, of course, it was a 5-player game, so that's always tricky at best, but it was nice to be able to actually see some friends and play.
Yeah.
And now we'll see if we go another 4 months before we get to do that again.
Probably.
Yeah, the way things are going. But hey, I'll take one is better than none.
Exactly.
So we might as well kind of jump right into this. We usually don't do a lot of extraneous stuff on these deck tech shows. And our patron supporter, Walker Telton, sent us a deck to take a look at. So why don't we start off and tell the listeners what Walker said to us about it.
Sure, Walker said his meta is fairly optimized, around 7 and 8s mostly, with the occasional cheeky 9 or 10. The goal of the deck is to win with cards that say you win the game when X counters are on this card, such as Azor's Elecutors or Helix Pinnacle, and it makes these cards more viable by cheating and stacking more counters than you should.
The weaknesses are that it's a deck that builds an engine which often requires several pieces on the board, but the commander can be an alt-win condition. Interested in us to focus on general improvements and any deep cuts and hidden gems we might find, and the budget is really no $100 cards, and that's about it. So overall, those requests are going to be tricky. This is such a specific deck that looking for alt-win conditions that are ways to interact with alt-win conditions that rely on counters on them to hit the win, there's just not a lot there, and for what he's trying to do with this deck, it's got all the pieces already kind of in play.
It does.
Was that kind of what you thought too, Max?
I did. I mean, there are a few other cards that we could suggest that are more opponent loses the game, but that definitely is not on theme for what Walker is trying to do.
Right. So we'll make a few suggestions, but we're probably going to do more show and tell kind of stuff here than we will doing a true deck tech, because it's just really, really specific. And it reminded me of the Pestilence deck I just built. Again, same thing. Like, I'm trying to win with that Pestilence effect, and there's like 5 or 6 Pestilence variants ever made, and I have cards interact with them and what have you. But if I gave that to somebody to do a deck tech on, despite the fact that it's less than a month old, I think they would also struggle finding ways to make those changes, just because it's super, super specific and there's just not a lot of things that aren't already in there that don't do what it's trying to do. So yeah, so we're going to probably have to lean a little more into show and tell here than we would a true tech, but it's a super interesting deck. So first things first, let's take a look at the land base. Max, you want to tell us about that?
So there are 36 lands total. There is a Bountiful Promenade, Breeding Pool, Canopy Vista, City Brass, Command Tower, Exotic Orchard, Flooded Grove, Flooded Strand, 5 forests, Glacial Fortress, Hallowed Fountain, Hinterland Harbor, 6 islands, a Karn's Bastion, Croson Verge, Llanowar Reborn, Mana Confluence, Nimbus Maze, 2 plains, Prairie Stream, Sea of Clouds, Sky Cloud Expanse, Sungrass Prairie, Sun Petal Grove, Temple Garden, and a Windswept Heath.
So what do you think of the land base? Before we talk about any additions we might have, are there any ones that you want to highlight or talk about in particular here?
The first one I want to talk about is Croson Verge. This is a land that comes into play tapped. It can produce a colorless, or you can pay 2 and sacrifice it to search your library for a forest and a plains card and put them onto the battlefield tapped, and then you shuffle your library. In a 3-color deck, it gets you 2 different duels. It can get you a Breeding Pool and a Hallowed Fountain, Temple Garden, vice versa, all those. It also gets the Battle for Zendikar lands. Seeing that this might be a slower deck, it might not be an issue that it comes into play tapped middle of the game. I run this in my Dramoka deck, and it's probably going to get cut once a better green-white duel just comes out.
To me, it's a land I think that probably most shines in a deck like this where you're not looking for speed and the fixing is useful. In this deck being a 3-color deck, going to get 2 dual lands and you're not looking to go super, super fast. I don't love it necessarily, and I agree it probably will be the next one when something better comes along to cut in your Dromoka deck, but I do think it does make sense here for the reasons I mentioned.
Yeah.
I still like, we obviously spoke very highly of those Battle Bond lands when they first came out. I'm glad to see people are running those. I feel like people have almost kind of forgot about them, maybe to a degree. They've also gotten kind of pricey. But I'm always glad to pull one of those lands, and I still put them when I build a new deck. If I can put them in a deck, I jam them in immediately.
Yeah, same here.
We have the Canopy Vista, which is, you mentioned before, these Battle for Zendikar lands that have dual types. There's a couple things that have dual types, which is relevant for a few of the sorceries and the fetch lands. Karn's Bastion in particular, there's a lot of proliferate effects in here, and we talked about cards that care about counters to win the game. So Karn's Bastion is expensive. It's 4 mana to use it, so when it taps itself, that's 5. And I do think it's probably better in a Super Friends deck because the difference between ulting and not ulting is huge, and it's oftentimes worth putting that one counter on a Planeswalker, and that can change the game, whereas the amount of counters you need to get on Darksteel Reactor or Helix Pinnacle to get that win. I guess Electors only needs a few, but it's probably less impactful here than it is in a Super Friends deck, is what I'm saying. But there's also really no downside to it. So even if it only makes a difference once every 20 games, still taps for a mana, doesn't come into play tapped. So I think it's not as amazing here as it is elsewhere, but I also think it's absolutely a card I would leave in the deck. How about things that you would add? Anything special there, Max?
I would definitely add some land destruction lands. We say it every show, but a simple Ghost Quarter would do great in this deck just to make sure, someone else's Karn's Bastion can be destroyed. Are there flipped growing rights or something like that?
We say it every show, but I legitimately believe every deck should have 2 land destruction lands and a Scavenger Grounds. And I don't want to be somebody who's talking about staples. Every deck needs to have this and this and this and this and this. And I get how that gets boring, but I also don't think anyone's making a land base to be exciting for the most part. If your land base is boring, for the most part, who cares? And man, even if your deck plays in the graveyard all the time, there's still situations where losing your graveyard to take out somebody else's is going to keep you from losing a game. And if you don't use it, you don't use it, kind of similar to Karn's Bastion that doesn't come into play tap. But I legitimately, if there's honestly anything that I would expose as a staple in Commander, full stop, the most important things staple-wise, I would say, that go in every deck are 2 land removal lands and a Scavenger Grounds. They will keep you from losing games, period. So I will say that one more time, and we will say that every time we do one of these when the deck doesn't have Scavenger Grounds and a couple land removal lands. And especially nowadays, Strip Mine and Wasteland are the 2 best, but they're expensive. Get it. Ghost Quarter and Tectonic Edge have limitations in other formats. In Commander, for the most part, you are not doing mana denial on turn 1, 2, or 3 or something where, Tech Edge is a problem or where Ghost Quarter replaces it, and that can prevent you from doing mana denial strategies. That's not what you're running them for in Commander. They are 90% as good as Strip Mine and Wasteland, close enough, and they are $1 each. So Tech Edge and Ghost Quarter, I would just find room for them in any deck. All right. Any other ones here for lands?
Nope, I'm good if you are.
That's what I've got here as well. It's a really tight land base. Make those few tweaks, and that's it for me. Let's look at creatures, because there's only 8 of them here. There's Azur's Elocutors. I don't know if it's Elocutors or Elocutors, or if that's even a real word. I don't even know. And that's 3 and Hybrid Azorius. It's a human advisor. At the beginning of your upkeep, put a filibuster counter on Azur's Elocutors. Then if the Elocutors have 5 or more filibuster counters on them, you win the game. And when a source deals damage to you, remove a filibuster counter. So they only need 5 to actually get to the game winning point. And it's at the beginning of your turn, so it is one of those things where you have to cast it and wait till your next. You do have to wait till your next upkeep, but it does something and then does the check. So if you're at 4 and it comes back around to you, you'll put a counter on it, and then you actually do the check immediately immediately and could conceivably win the game there. So that is kind of nice. The downside is whenever a source deals damage to you, remove a counter. So the turn before, everyone's going to be gunning for you, and it will be tricky to protect yourself and the card, I think. We have a Deep Glow Skate here. It's a way to double the counters on a permanent, and that will work with all of the win conditions. A Flux Channeler, whenever you cast a non-creature spell, proliferate. So that's like half the cards in this deck. Technically more than that because there's only 36 lands and 8 creatures, so more than half the cards trigger Flux Channeler. Pure Imaginative Rascal is kind of a hardened scales for non-+1 counters. If one or more counters we put onto a permanent your team controls, put that many +1 of that kind of counters on it instead. Seedborn Muse is the way to get a big untap. It's never ever a bad card, but it works really nicely with one of the alt win conditions here in Helix Pinnacle. We have a Thrumming Bird. It's a flyer for 2 mana. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, proliferate. We have Viral Drake, which has flying and infect. Maybe that's one more, kind of desperate win condition, even though I think it's the only thing with infect in here. But you can spend 4 mana and proliferate, and that is not a tap ability. So if you have a bunch of mana, you can dump it into proliferating things. And the last, Varel the Hulk Clade, for a green and a blue, you can tap Varel and double the amount of counters on target artifact, creature, or land. So, again, this is a really tight group of creatures, and I do like all of them, I think. What are your thoughts on the creatures?
I definitely like all of them. They all play a part in the plan to either double counters on the Elecutors or the other win the game cards in the deck.
I don't know what I would change here. There are things you could add. I think there's a few creatures that would do basically similar things to what's already being done here. Evolution Sage is going to trigger whenever a land comes into play, so that's going to be a free proliferate effect, and if you ramp out lands, and there's a few ramp spells in here, or use that Corrosive Verge or use that fetch land, you're going to get double triggers. I would consider Evolution Sage. You also have Grateful Apparition and Guildpact Informant that proliferate on combat damage. Technically, Grateful Apparition is strictly better than Thrumming Bird in this deck. Thrumming Bird is 1 in a blue, has flying, and when it deals combat damage to a player, proliferate. Grateful Apparition is 1 in a white with flying, and when it deals combat damage to a player or planeswalker, proliferate. They're both 1/1, so one's blue, one's white, but it's the same CMC. They both have flying, but Apparition also works if you hit someone's planeswalker. I would run Apparition over Thrumming Bird just for that reason, because it's technically slightly better. I'd be tempted to run both. I think if Thrumming Bird's good enough for your deck, so it's Grateful Apparition. And then I think at that point, if those are both good enough, Guildpact Informant has only 1 more mana. It's 3 to do the same thing. But I think he's hurting for slots too here. I don't know what you would take out necessarily. So 6 of one, half dozen of the other, but I would run Apparition over Thrumming Bird. Any ones here you want to shout out, Max?
The only one I would think to add, since a lot of the pieces of this deck you need on the board, and there isn't a lot of graveyard recursion built into this deck, I would try to find a slot for Sun Titan. It's going to recur 25 of the non-land cards in this deck that it could potentially recur. And those include some of the win condition cards, such as Helix Pinnacle or Simic Ascendancy, that we'll get to later.
Yeah, some graveyard recursion is always really, really useful. Savin's Reclamation hits a lot of stuff here too, but I actually do kind of agree some Sun Titan might be better, especially because things like Elocutors need you to defend yourself, and having that big Sun Titan body out is going to help with that. And in general, this deck doesn't have a lot of combat damage or defense, and being able to have that body out there to stop people from slamming into you while you get your plan going, I do like Sun Titan here for that reason as well. Sun Titan is 6 mana is not nothing, and I don't want to say Sun Titan's overplayed, but I do think it's overplayed. So I guess I do want to say that. But I do see sometimes people play it where I'm like, there's not a lot of good targets in this deck, and I think you'd be better off, especially if someone's playing green and white. I'm like, if you need a recurring effect, run that Eternal Witness, run a Regrowth, and get 1 card back. Don't assume you're going to keep that Sun Titan out for 10 turns. But I think this deck is one where you gain added utility from having it as a 6-drop, and it's a slow deck, so you are planning on staying around long enough to maybe use it a few turns. So while I am not the world's biggest Sun Titan fan, again, kind of like I said with Corrosive Verge, I think this is a really good deck for it. So I also second your Sun Titan suggestion.
Cool.
Any other creatures here?
Not for me.
Yeah, again, it's just tight. So we mentioned a few of these alt-win conditions, Max, and a couple of them, aside from Elocutors, are over under enchantments. Should we jump over there and talk about those next?
Yeah, let's do it. So there are 12 total enchantments in the deck. We have Aura of Silence, doubling Season and Hardened Scales, 2 big key pieces to help generate these extra counters on these permanents. Helix Pinnacle, one of the win cons, it's a 1-mana enchantment with Shroud, and then you can pay X to put X amount of tower counters on it. And at the beginning of your upkeep, if there are 100 or more tower counters on Helix Pinnacle, you win the game. We have Inexorable Tide. It's a 5-mana enchantment that lets you proliferate whenever you cast a spell. We have Mystic Remora. Paradox Haze gives you 2 upkeeps. Privileged Position gives all your other things hexproof. Rhystic Study, just another draw spell. Simic Ascendancy, another win con in the deck. It's 2 mana. Whenever 1 or more +1/+1 counters are put on a creature you control, put that many growth counters on Simic Ascendancy. And then at the beginning of your upkeep, if Simic Ascendancy has 20 or more growth counters on it, you win the game. And you can also pay 1 in Simic to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. And wrapping it up, we have Smothering Tithe and Sylvan Library.
Speaking of talking about staples, if you're playing, well, and I don't mean that in a bad way, like if you're playing white or green, Smothering Tithe is so good. If you have access to white, it's almost always worth running. And Sylvan Library is so good. If you have access to green, it's almost always worth running. So they're just 2 excellent cards in almost any situation, and they're in this deck. And that's true, really. Mystic Remora and Rhystic Study, you're never wrong running those in a blue deck either. They're just amazing draw spells. And especially in this kind of deck, I don't run Remora and Rhystic Study. I run them in one deck. They're both in my Sphinx deck. They're not in any of my other blue decks, in part because they're both a little bit annoying in that you have to ask everyone every turn. And they're so good. I just was, in order to keep some variety in my decks, not have every blue deck having some staples, I'm not running those two. This, however, is not only is this not my deck, your win conditions are so narrow and this deck is so specific. I think you can do those kind of things and not feel bad about it. You're like, I'm handicapping myself so much that I do not feel bad about running Rhystic Study and Remora and Sylvan Library and Smothering Tithe, because you need those kind of really, really strong staples to have a chance to compete when your deck is very much fighting with one hand behind its back.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I'm surprised there aren't more taxing effects in this list just because
to slow everybody else up.
To slow everybody else up,
Yeah.
Especially with only 9 total creatures between Jenara
Right.
and the other 8 in the deck.
And speaking of taxes, there is Aura of Silence in here, which doubles as a removal spell, and artifacts and enchantments your opponents cast cost 2 more. That's really a card. I like Aura of Silence, and it's one of those things I'm like, oh, that looks good, I'll put it in a deck. If you've never played against someone else's Aura of Silence, I don't know if you appreciate how powerful that effect is.
It's so good.
Yes, and there's so many times you look at your hand and go, okay, I'll cast this turn and then do that, and you're like, oh, I have a 2 tax on this artifact, so I can't cast it this turn, so I can only cast this one spell, and then next turn I can't cast it either, and the turn after that, not only does it cost them 2 more mana to cast, it pushes back the turn in which you can afford to cast that Chromatic Lantern, robbing them of the additional mana the artifact would generate over the next few turns. So it's not just a tax of 2, it almost winds up oftentimes being a tax of 3 or 4 on artifacts, because it's delaying how long it can be until they actually get productivity out of it, when they would normally have cast it on turn 4 and then got to immediately start using it to gain 2 mana on, turn 5, turn 6, turn 7, turn 8, whatever. So yeah, if you are ever on the fence with Aura of Silence, it's an absolute monster. And if someone goes to remove it, you just sack it and take out the biggest threat.
Yep.
It's, short of a Croson grip, it's always going to kill the thing you want gone for the most part, and it's going to be annoying until you actually have to use it. I don't think Doubling Season requires too much to say here. When he goes to put counters on his win conditions, it's going to double them. Hardened Scale, similarly, is just like a baby Doubling Season, so it's going to add 1 additional counter on everything, both of which interface with the commander, so if you aren't careful, Jenara is just accidentally going to dome you here as well, so there's some utility with all of those things in the commander, even if it's just a, plan D. It's still there. In X Tide, whenever you cast a spell Proliferate, whenever you cast a spell, it's not like non-creature or instant or sorcery or whatever. Any spell you cast puts more counters on things that in this deck presumably will win you the game. That's also a tricky card for opponents to deal with, because you'll see it come down and you'll look around and go, okay, I don't know if I'm too worried about that. And then something else comes down and then 2 other spells get cast, and then that Illocutors is in a position to win the game then, without you even kind of having a chance to respond. It's not a card you run outside of this kind of deck, but it's really useful here. Paradox Haze is going to give 1 extra chance to put counters on things like the Illocutors during your upkeep step. Privileged Position is a way to protect all your stuff, and its other permanents too, which in this deck is a big deal. It's going to protect that Darksteel Reactor and protect the Illocutors and protect all your other cards that are helping to draw you cards and get you in a position to win. And the last one here, Simic Ascendancy. This is a card I'm genuinely shocked I haven't seen in more decks, I guess. It's 3 mana, 1 a blue and a green to put a +1 counter on target creature you control, and then whenever 1 or more +1 counters are put onto a creature you control, put that many growth counters onto it, and at the beginning of your upkeep, if it has 20 or more growth counters on it, you win the game. It doesn't even need that condition on it, I don't think, and that's a good card. Like, if it just puts counters on things as a bonus when you put a counter on it, that's really, really good. And it winds up being a alt-win condition here in this deck. It's a card that I feel like should be in any +1 counters deck that has access to it, and this is a great home for it. Well, I mentioned the artifact that does the same thing, so I guess to continue our trend of going from one to the other, Max, what are the artifacts in this deck?
We have 14 artifacts. Majority of them are mana rocks, so you have your all 4 signets, Chromatic Lantern, Everflowing Chalice, Felwar Stone, Soul Ring, but then we also have a Sword of Truth and Justice, Mirage Mirror, Midnight Clock, Darksteel Reactor, Contagion Engine, and Contagion Clasp.
Basically, we have the win condition in Darksteel Reactor, which is 4 mana. It has Indestructible. At the beginning of your upkeep, you may put a charge counter on Darksteel Reactor, and when it has 20 or more charge counter on it, you win the game. So that isn't even a check condition. It isn't even like at end of turn or during your upkeep. Whenever it has 20 on it, you win the game. It is indestructible, but it is not hexproof, so it is a little vulnerable. But it doesn't die to sweepers, so as long as you can keep someone from targeting it, you are in pretty good shape. And 20 isn't a ton either. Getting the first one on there might take a turn, but after that you can start doubling and proliferating, and that seems like that might be the most reliable of these X counter win conditions in this deck. What do you think?
Yeah, I definitely think it's probably in the best one, if not the second best one, depending on if Jenara comes out early, depending on how the game's going. That and Simic Ascendancy might be better.
I like Midnight Clock just kind of in general. It's a mana rock, and it's going to wheel just you and put stuff from your graveyard back into your library as well. Especially in Commander, it's only a couple trips around the board and it works. And it's the kind of card that I think it feels bad to remove too if you're an opponent. So I'm just a fan of the card, and I'm surprised it doesn't see a little more play than it does right now. Mirage Mirror, always good, copies anything. Proliferate effects we mentioned, Contagion Clasp, Contagion Engine. Everflowing Chalice is a good rock that just kind of interfaces accidentally with Proliferate. I think it's probably worth running in most decks just as a 2-drop rock with upside, but it's so much better here because you can, play it for 2 mana on turn 2, and then throughout the course of doing the stuff you're doing, just proliferate it up to, tap for 5 or 6 mana, which then in turn interacts very nicely with Helix Pinnacle. So kind of a perfect deck for that card. The one I maybe don't love here is Sword of Truth and Justice.
I agree with you here.
3 to cast and 2 to equip. Creature gets +2/+2 and has protection from white and blue. Protection is relevant, and it makes Jenara bigger. And when equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, put a +1 counter on a creature you control, then proliferate. So it's going to hit somebody, and it'll get a counter and put an additional counter on whatever stuff you care about. But you only have 8 creatures. I'm guessing it's going on Jenara most of the time, but I also feel like maybe not casting Jenara until you absolutely have nothing else to do, because that's not the focus of the deck. Only a couple of these creatures have evasion to be able to get through anyway. I don't think it's a bad card. I just don't know how often it's useful in this deck.
I definitely think it is strictly used for Jenara or a couple of the other creatures with flying. It plays in with the +1/+1 counter synergies with a couple of the other win cons in the deck. So I understand why it's here, and it's a newer card. It's from Modern Horizons.
Yeah.
If there were a couple Planeswalkers in here, that'd be more beneficial. I don't know what I'd cut it for, so I'm fine with it being in the deck.
And maybe that's enough. Like maybe just being on Jenara is enough value that it's worth running.
Right.
It was just the main one that kind of jumped out at me as being like, I could see that underperforming, but
I mean, putting it on Jenara is then a 5/5. It hits, it gets a +1/+1 counter, and then it proliferates probably that +1/+1 counter. So there's now Jenara's a 7/7. And you
Right.
didn't have to spend 1 and a white to put the counter on it, so...
Yep. In addition to whatever other stuff that's going to proliferate along the way.
Right. So,
Yeah,
I'm good with it.
I'm torn. I don't think it's bad at all. That was the one that jumped out at me. I went to the first thing when I looked at the artifacts, I'm like, why is this thing not here? And then I looked at the notes, and you already had it written down as one of your additions. So I will let you read this one off as your suggestion.
Oh, my suggestion would be Rings of Brighthearth. It is a 3-mana artifact that says whenever you play an activated ability, if it isn't a mana ability, you may pay 2. If you do, copy that ability, then choose new targets for the copy. There are so many things it's going to copy, so you could copy Varel, you could copy your Helix Pinnacle activation. There's more. I know there's more, and that's why I put it in here. You copy Jenara.
Yeah, for sure. This is an easy one to miss, too. And I know it's one of those things you look at it and you're like, that should definitely be in this deck. I ran my Super Friends, Mono White Super Friends deck without this for 8 to 10 months, and I had 2 of them. It wasn't like I wasn't running it because I just hadn't got around to picking one up. I had this sitting in a binder, and for whatever reason, my brain just, I was running every proliferate effect out there. I just never thought about copying the activated abilities on Planeswalkers with Rings of Brighthearth. So it's not that people don't know it's a great card, they do, but I myself overlooked it. So it's entirely possible that in this case, Walker just has kind of did the exact same thing I did, because I feel like if it's in here, it would be really, really useful.
Yeah.
All right, we have Instants and Sorceries left here. So let's look at the instance. There's a lot of removal kind of dominating this field, as well as a few things that interact with these counters. Beast Within and Generous Gift, both great removal spells that will hit any target. Cyclonic Rift, obviously a Cyclonic Rift. The card's insane. Clock Spinning is a 1-mana instant for a single blue with buyback of 3, and you can choose a counter on target permanent or suspended card, so in this case it's just going to be a permanent. Remove that counter from that permanent, or put another one of those counters on it. So it's a way with buyback to just add more counters to something as a mana sink. Instant speed too, so you can do it as a trick when someone thinks they have a turn or 2 left till it matters. You can just drop this twice and roll that Elocutor's up or roll that Darksteel Reactor up into lethal territory before someone when they think they have a chance to breathe and they actually don't. Dovin's Veto as a counterspell here, along with Negate and Swan Song to protect your board state. Elodrami's Call is a 2-mana instant. Search your library for a creature card, reveal it and put it into your hand. I'm going to guess that's going for things like Varel or Deep Glow Skate to double the counters on something. Enlightened Tutor to go grab one of those game-winning enchantments. It also gets artifacts. You can go grab Darksteel Reactor as well. Force of Vigor, just a free way to deal with things that are a problem. Growth Spiral, 2-mana instant, draw a card, and you can put a land from your hand onto the battlefield. Heroic Intervention, great card that's just getting reprinted in the core set. A way to protect your stuff because it is all permanents. Mystical Tutor, instant or sorcery, and reveal the card and put it on the top of your library. And Teferi's Protection, again, great piece of protection to save all your stuff and yourself. So, any thoughts about any of these, Max?
I think this is great. This is a slow-moving deck. You want all the protection through the counter spells, and all the removal through the Beast Withins and the Generous Gifts type cards. And then there's a perfect amount of tutors to go find what you are looking for. Go get that Simic Ascendancy or that Helix Pinnacle. The one card I think I would add, though, and again, it goes back to the graveyard recursion, because there are so few pieces that make this deck win the way it wants to win. I would put in Once and Future from Throne of Eldraine, and it's an instant for 3 and a green. You can return 1 target card from your graveyard to your hand and 1 target card to the top of your library. Or if you use the Adamant cost, which is paying 3 green for it, both cards go to your hand.
Okay.
I run that in quite a few of my decks. It's in Dromoka for sure, and I think I have it in Tuvasa. And it just does tons of work in those decks. You can let your commander stay in the graveyard to recur it, or you can, go get that Helix Pinnacle that was destroyed in a board wipe or something like that. And it also gets stuff like Cyclonic Rift back, or any of your instants or sorceries.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I mean, recursion's almost never a bad plan in a deck like this, especially one that is looking for certain win conditions or certain enablers, and it really sucks to lose those to the graveyard. So having a way to recur those, and there's not a ton of recursion in this deck, as we mentioned when we were talking about Sun Titan, is pretty useful. So I'm on board with that. The one I don't maybe love here is Growth Spiral. I like the card, but I also feel like it never quite does enough. draw it in turn 2, I guess you can draw a card and ramp out a land because there's a decent chance you have one in hand. But I think it feels pretty bad to have on turn 7 when odds are there's a good chance when you get to that point in the game you've already put all your lands into play. So it winds up being a 2-mana draw 1 card, and maybe you'll then hit a land that you can ramp out. But more often than not, that card might, even if it's a land, might just be the land you need for turn for your land drop because it's turn 7 and you've possibly already played all the lands you started the game with. I feel like it looks like a strong card on its surface, and I feel like it never quite performs that way. I would rather just ramp. I would rather just run a rampant growth and just go get a land and put it into play every time. Do you have any thoughts on Growth Spiral in particular?
I like Growth Spiral. I've seen what it's done in like standard. Okay. It wrecked house there. But I do agree. I think in EDH it's either really good right away in the game, but late game it probably is just like you said, a 2-mana draw 1. If this was more of like a lands deck, or there were more things that proliferated when lands came into play, I could justify running it. Right. But yeah, I agree with you. Go swap this out for a Sorcery Speed, Farseek, or Rampant Growth, and just get the land.
Or even a Mana Rock. Like just I think some of that's me mentally. I like to know what my card is going to do and have it do the thing I want it to do every single time. And I feel like the first couple times that Growth Spiral was in my hand when I didn't have the ability to make an extra land drop, that would be very frustrating to me. And maybe it isn't to Walker, so that could just be an issue of personal play style and how your brain works with cards too. So that's one I wanted to point out. Any additions you wanted to put in here, Max, under instance, aside from the ones in future?
Unfortunately, no. I thought about adding the new white instant from Commander 20 that gives all your creatures indestructible, but there are so few creatures in this deck, and the win cons we want to protect are artifacts and enchantments. So, nope, I'm good. What about you?
Yeah, nothing there either. I feel like there's only 3 counter spells, and in a deck that kind of needs defense, I wouldn't mind to see another one here, whether it's like an Arcane Denial or something. I think you want to avoid the 2-mana blue counter spells because it's a 3-color deck, but I don't know necessarily what I would pull out either. Maybe I put that in that Growth Spiral slot and just have one more protection thing in that slot. I don't know. But yeah, no, that's a pretty good cluster of instants as well, and it's kind of what I would put in a deck. So last but not least, what do we have here for sorceries?
15 sorceries total. So we have some board wipes in Austere Command, Cleansing Nova, and Wrath of God, and Supreme Verdict. We do have some ramp in Nature's Lore, Pier's Whim, and Skyshroud Claim. We have some tutors in Fabricate, Idyllic Tutor, and Wargate. Wargate's kind of an old one. It's from the Alara blocks. It's X and Bant. And you search your library for a permanent card with converted mana cost X or less and put it into play, then shuffle your library. So 4 mana, go get Helix Pinnacle. That seems pretty good.
Yeah.
We have some draw spells in here with Tezzeret's Gambit, Recurring Insight, and one final one here would be Planewide Celebration, just another proliferate card in the deck, and the little bit of recursion is Seasons Past, one of my favorites.
Yeah, I like Planewide Celebration a lot. That was from War of the Spark. It's 7 mana, so it's a lot, but you can choose 4 modes in the card, and you can choose the same one more than once, and the modes are create a 2/2 citizen creature token, return target permanent card from your graveyard to your hand, so there's some recursion there, proliferate, and gain 4 life. In this kind of deck where you have something like the Allocutors, that is enough to win. Like, once you have if you cast them and have them in play and you can put 4 more counters on there, that's enough to get you there. And especially in a deck that's doubling things as well, that 4 can go up to 8 really quick. Similarly to Karn's Bastion, I think this is probably better in a Super Friends deck, where putting 4 counters on a Planeswalker, or even 2, on 2 Planeswalkers or 3, but like, even on 1, that's the difference between ulting and not ulting. That's the difference between ulting, like, when you're way off the ult, too. And getting that emblem can be almost impossible to bounce back from. So I think it's an amazing card that should be in more Super Friends decks that have access to green, but it's really, really good here too, and I like to see it show up. 4 board wipes, and they're modular ones for the most part in Austere Command, in Cleansing Nova at least, and Supreme Verdict is uncounterable. Wrath of God's just cheap and efficient, so I like all those. I'm glad you mentioned Wargate, Max. That's a card I think that doesn't see enough play, particularly because it puts the permanent directly into play, so it's not like it goes to the top of your library and costs you a draw, basically. That's a card I'm a fan of, and it's good to see that show up as well. Recurring Insight is a card that I'm a fan of from way back in the day. I don't know if nowadays it's that efficient, but it's still a super fun card. 6 mana, and you draw cards equal to the number of cards in an opponent's hand. And then it has rebound. So super, super useful here as well. Any sorceries you wanted to talk about or add here?
I kind of mentioned it when we were talking about Growth Spiral, but I would put in a Farseek just because it will get your duels that aren't, any of your duels, essentially. You mentioned Rampant Growth, but those would be the only two I can really think of.
The only thing I had here, and I know it's not an X spell, and it does, or X counters win condition, I'd be tempted to put in Approach the Second Sun here. I think it's on theme enough because you're doing alt-win stuff, and it's just one more of those cards, and I feel like, especially in a deck that's themed around doing alt-win condition stuff, super easy to justify as being part of the theme too. There are some decks that make it really, really easy to get to that approach. I don't want to say too easy, but it's maybe less of an accomplishment to get it done in a deck that has a bunch of ways baked into your commander to dig down or something. That isn't the case here. If you cast it, you're going to have to maybe work at it. And I guess maybe that's a reason not to run it. I don't know. But I do think it's definitely the kind of card that you can run here and not feel like it's cheesy at all. So that would be the one I might suggest. I also do like Farseek that you suggested because it does go get those dual lands, which is not something Rampant Growth does, and in a 3-color deck that's really, really useful. And Tezzeret's Gambit is in here as a draw spell. You also, I think, mentioned Contentious Plans, which draws you and has Proliferate baked into it, and I think that's very useful here. Maybe more than Deep Analysis.
Yeah, I'd probably agree with that as well.
So I would probably put that in the Deep Analysis slot. So that is Walker's 2+2 = 5 deck, and having talked about it, the 2+2 = 5 thing makes a little more sense now, even if it might not be mathematically entirely right. So any final thoughts from you, Max?
I think this is a really cool deck. Like we've kind of been saying, I think it isn't a fast deck. It's definitely a slower, like you said in the notes, builds the machine. I'd be really interested in playing against it someday, once we can play Paper Magic with tons of people at once.
Yeah.
Just because I've really only ran into Helix Pinnacle decks in mono green because it's easy to double all your green mana really fast in mono green.
Right.
So it'd be really cool to play against this and the multiple ways to win. I think it's a really cool deck.
The one thing I can appreciate here is something I've kind of noticed myself lately. Now that I have, 8 decks or 9 decks, or at least I did last year, and I think I'm up to 11 now. Whenever I went to build a deck, I found myself going well, is this doing anything that another deck of mine doesn't already do? And maybe, somebody doesn't care about that, but for me, I try to have my decks not just be different in their color composition. I don't want 2 Simic decks, for example, but I want it to play differently too, because then it's what's the point, really, at least for me, if it isn't a different experience to play that deck. And the more decks you have, the more difficult it gets to do something that you're not already doing, which is part of the reason I built an Infect deck this year, and I built a Pestilence deck, because those are both different in the decks I have. I respect this deck for that same reason. It's a deck that's going to win and has a plan that's, I almost guarantee, different from not only any deck that Walker probably already has, but any deck he's going to see where he plays. So that's something I'm always looking to do with a new deck I build, and I have a lot of appreciation for the fact that he found a way to do it here with this band deck. All right, I think that is going to do it for this week's Deck Tech. Thank you very much to Walker and to all our Patreon supporters for supporting the show. It's a big deal and it means a lot, so thank you. We will be back on Monday with, I believe, Jumpstart review. Is that correct, Max?
That sounds correct to me.
All right. I'm Dana. You can find me on the Twitter birds at Dana Roach. You can find Max at CMDR_Max, and you can find Chris at OWiseSquishy1. Our podcast editor is Rafael Garcia. You can find him at Ursa Bearwalker, and our podcast theme is Retro Future Dirty by Kevin MacLeod, licensed via Creative Commons. Until next week, I'm Dana.
And I'm Max.